Good day, everyone. My name is Mofaramade Atanda, and I'm presenting on colonial education and the nervous condition, Tambu's Postcolonial Bildungsroman. My mentor is Caitlin Shaw, and I'm presenting from Nigeria. And I'm presenting for three reasons. Firstly, to talk about history. The main character's slightly unconventional trajectory serves as a key lesson in the dynamism of the African experience, particularly that of the African woman, in post-colonial eras, and poses a better understanding of how well they fared within the system. Secondly, to talk about the genre. The unconventional growth of the character is directly parallel to how the author inverts the norms of the Bildungsroman genre. By showing this narrative story not as a neat assimilation into society, but rather as a redefinition and reclamation of self, the author invariably defies the expectations of literary norms on her work. Thirdly, to talk about culture and colonialism. This essay and presentation show how colonial education structures serve as a means to psychologically subjugate the indigenous people and acted as an agent of acculturation, while also posing as a means of escape from cultural patriarchy. What happens when learning a language also means inheriting a history or being trapped by the power of a system? This essay takes up that question through Sisi Dangaremba's nervous conditions, where colonial education and the English language become tools that both open doors and impose limits. By tracing how the adult narrator revisits her childhood with sharp cultural awareness, the essay follows her journey of becoming while unpacking the costs of that growth. It also situates the novel within the post-colonial Bildungsroman and explores his dialogue with Franz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, the text from whose preface, written by Jean-Paul Sartre, Dangaremba borrows her title to frame her piercing study of the colonized self. Quite simply, this project claims that Dangaremba uses Tambu's story in her Bildungsroman, a novel of education and coming of age, to expose language and education as the terrain of colonial identity conflict, and to reimagine growth not as assimilation but as the painful reclamation of self. Pictured here are Sisi Dangaremba, Franz Fanon, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the cover of the text in question, all integral to the analysis presented by this project. This nervous condition names the psychic fracture driven by colonial rule, a split identity torn between ancestral belonging and imposed foreignness. It's the colonially imposed psychological imbalance that weighs on the native and which threatens to destroy mind and self. Dangaremba's novel explores the odd effects of the combination of patriarchy and colonial influence on women's growth, all the while highlighting the role of language and how its application can act as a catalyst to either breaking free of or succumbing to nervous conditions, exemplified particularly by the main character, Tambuza Sigalke, but not only her. Tambudazi's narrative does not only tell her own story. After all, as she announces in the first paragraph of the novel, her story is really about my escape and Shia's, about my mother's and my guru's entrapment, and about Nyasha's rebellion. Nyasha, far-minded and isolated, my uncle's daughter, whose rebellion may not in the end have been successful. She tells different parallel sides of the same story, where the variance of certain factors like education and the willingness to assimilate leads to far greater differences in their relative success. With Tambu statistics, only 2 out of 5 made it to freedom. Speaking, of course, of a freedom that is more than just physical. Tambu's self-reclamation is only able to subvert the settlers' work, according to Fanon's quote here, as a result of subtle defiance of what she should be and a deviation from typical Bildungsromans as portrayed by the novel. For African writers, Ngugi wa Thiong'o argues, to adopt colonial languages without critique perpetuates cultural domination. Dangaremba dramatizes this thesis. Early in Tambu's schooling and development, English is a source of empowerment, granting access and status, but later it evolves into a weapon of psychological control. The very ideas of development, especially as these ideas are tied to the English language, with their connotation of civilization as a purely colonial concept, and the traditional Bildungsroman aren't neutral or innocent. They are built within and help sustain the sexist and racist power structures of colonial rules. How do these two quotes on my screen relate? Language is not just a means of narration, it is an active character in her becoming. Tambo emerges not as a passive product of colonial schooling, but as an author of her own becoming, resolutely human, unapologetically hybrid, showing the use of both Shona and English narrates, and profoundly free. Nervous Conditions is a masterful deconstruction of the post-colonial Bildungsroman, revealing how formal education and Englishness, loudest as paths to freedom, become instruments of psychic bondage. Through the adult narrator sociocultural insights, Dangaramba unveils the nervous condition at the heart of colonial subjectivity, an affliction diagnosed by Sartre and Fanon, and theorized by Ngugi as a cultural struggle waged in language itself. Tambu's journey from dazzled pupil to critical agent charts a procedure of decolonization that is internal, fragmented, and triumphant in its refusal to conform. These are my sources, and thank you very, very much.